This is lecture for chapter 10, lecture number 2. In this lecture, we'll be covering China and agriculture, industry, economics, and urbanization. We'll start with agriculture. This map is in your textbook on page 463 and describes the various agricultural regions within China. We see most of the agriculture is on the eastern part of China. With to the west, we see oasis agriculture in the drier interior, but the lowland areas in the west have oases style agriculture with various crops being grown as well as herding. As we move to the northeast, we see to the far north in the kind of tan region, we see spring wheat, coarse grains, and soybean being grown. More spring wheat here, more to the interior. As we move to the south, we have a region where winter wheat is possible to be grown, which means they can multi-crop and have a winter wheat and then plant again in the spring. Once the winter wheat has grown in the spring and is harvested, another round of crops can be grown. Also in this region, we see millet and corn, some cotton, additional corn. And to the south, we have a transitional region in the north part of the southern agriculture with rice and winter wheat. To the interior, we have rice and dry grains. And to the south, we are in tea, rice, and to the far south, in the southeast portion of China, we can double crop rice, meaning there's 2 crops of rice each year, greatly increasing the food production. Technology in agriculture has allowed China to improve its production, which is very much needed considering the size of the population. The Qin Mountain Divide here pretty much separates the wheat and grain agriculture to the north and the rice and winter wheat regions to the south. Even in the 1990s, China was still predominantly an agricultural country, with only 7% of the world's most arable land and only half of that considered good quality agricultural land. We discussed the 3 primary agricultural regions of the oasis agriculture: to the west, to the northeast, grains, and to the south, rice, southeast. There's widespread use of agricultural intensification, very heavy agricultural use of the land where agriculture is profitable. There's supplementary crops we'll talk about in a minute. Many of these supplementary crops are cultivated for commercial purposes after the initial grain crops have been produced. These include vegetables, soybeans, and fruit orchards that are important for the growing affluence of the urban classes in the industrial portions of China in the east. Post-Mao agricultural reform includes the household responsibility system of 1978. The household responsibility system allowed each peasant household a piece of land on which to produce a specific amount of grain to be sold to the state at a regulated price. Once that contract is fulfilled, the household is free to produce cash crops to sell privately at local markets or to the state at above market prices. This system, along with the Green Revolution technologies, resulted in a dramatic increase in the production of major crops, especially the vegetables and fruits, for increasingly affluent urban markets. The ability, kind of the free capital allowance of the government for additional agricultural land and a variety of crops really influenced the peasant agriculturalists to improve their methods and produce larger amounts of cash crops. Reforms that increase industrial production for the global markets and increase urban affluence increased the demand for the high-quality vegetables, fruit, and additionally meat. Consequently, rural incomes have increased significantly. The government hedges against food insecurity, a long-term problem in China, by providing subsidies to farmers who ensure sufficient production of wheat and rice for consumers. Changing diets have increased demand for wheat and rice substantially, thereby aiding this hedge in development of agriculture by the Chinese government. And of course, this made the peasants feel empowered. By 1991, production increased dramatically due to greater use of fertilizers, Green Revolution hybrid varieties, but there are still some drawbacks. There's underproduction of grains and cotton. Government prices favored vegetables and fruit, but the free markets increased. Food consumption of the more affluent created additional demands on those foods. Economic growth of China. Policy to promote regional self-sufficiency through spatially equitable distribution of manufacturing by creating various manufacturing zones, as we'll discuss here in a minute. This goal was reasonably successful later in the 20th century, and into the 21st century has been extremely successful. The global economy made China a richer nation, although it brought some inequities between the industrial East Coast regions and the interior agricultural regions. And even in the case of in the industrial regions, some places benefited greater than others. Mineral resource endowment and distribution. China has a full complement of mineral resources for industrial goal. It is the world's largest producer of coal, second largest consumer of oil, but it still must import vast quantities of both coal and oil. It's third in global production of iron ore, first in tin, and third in production of lead and zinc minerals. China's early industrial development was in heavy industry, including iron and steel, chemical manufacturing, electricity generation, as well as textiles. All are state-owned enterprises, meaning industry driven by either the national government or more typically regional government enterprises. Due to military relations, new industrial development needed an interior location to avoid external attack, and so much of the military industrial complexes have been developed further inland, although still in the east. Late in the 1970s, there was a dramatic change in industrial policy. It increased levels of financial aid. Decision-making was decentralized. There was a transition from rigid central planning to free market principles in each of the regions. This created a rapid growth of town and village enterprises, or TVEs. The TVEs were able to manufacture various subcomponents of larger manufactured goods and spread the industrial economy and its affluence for the workers further throughout eastern China. China's three industrial regions. The three primary urban economic regions are the Pearl River Delta, the Yangtze River Delta, and the Bohai Rim region. There are examples of similarities and differences of each of their characteristics. Each of the three is anchored by an older core. The Pearl River Delta by Hong Kong, the Yangtze River Delta by Shanghai, and the Bohai Rim region by Beijing. The core of the Pearl River and Yangtze River each has developed more recently with a suburban focus. Beijing remains the core of the Bohai Rim region, reflecting more recent emergence of this region in the global economy. Pearl River got its boost in the global economy in 1979, followed by the Yangtze River Delta region in 1990. More recently, the Bohai Rim has been extremely affluent. Population in 2010 was around 100 million in the Yangtze River Delta development region, 80 million in the Boheme Rim, and 60 million in the Pearl River. Whereas Pearl River and Yangtze forays into the global economy began earlier with relatively low value added industrial products, they were later restructured into higher value added high-tech products. The Boheme Rim began with more high-tech products and then is now supported by an array of high-quality universities. The PDR, or Pearl Rivers, was known as the sweatshop of the world. Shanghai was noted early on as the Paris of the East, with a very international culture, whereas Boheme Rim Association with high-tech universities and the capital, as well as information technology. Probably one important thing to really note here is the similarities of these regions to the treaty port locations of the 19th century following the Opium Wars, where British military and British Navy were able to open up the port regions to commercialization and globalized commerce. Here we see a map from page 466 of China and the special economic zones, the Boheme Rim region around Beijing. We have the Yangtze River Delta region in the Middle East portion of China. We have a couple of other regions, including Hainan, developing more recently, and the Pearl River Delta region centered on Hong Kong, which is formerly a British colony, but now is considered part of China, and we'll talk about that as a special discussion here in a minute. Mineral resources of China. This map on page 465 of your text shows extensive gas and oil fields throughout the country. Much of them are on the interior, but transportation systems have been developed to move a lot of this energy into the industrial regions in the east. Coal is relatively prevalent throughout much of the country and is used extensively for manufacturing and creates many pollution problems, especially in Beijing, but also in other regions and in the other economic commercial regions to the east. China's mix of domestic energy resources consists of coal, oil, natural gas, hydroelectric power generation, some nuclear, with wind and solar prevalent more to the west. Although it may have all the energy resources it needs to meet its industrial goal, the growth of energy demands for domestic uses other than industry and the cost of bringing domestic energy resources to areas that need them have required China to rely increasingly on imported energy fuels since the mid-1990s. The country relies on coal for most of its energy needs, using both domestic and imported coal. China is the leading coal producer and importer in the world. Oil is imported from the Persian Gulf and increasingly from sub-Saharan Africa as well. Hydroelectric power is important, but to keep up with demand for electricity, many new power plants must be constructed each year, and that causes environmental degradation and changes in the plant and animal life of interior China. Wind and solar power abound in the west especially, but these are far from the demand centers of the coastal east and southeast, and transporting that energy efficiently from the west to the east over that great distance has proven to be quite difficult. China has inequities within its economic systems. Factors include FDI, or foreign direct investment, as well as private domestic investment, and the town and village enterprises' economic impact. The winners in this system are the coastal towns, where the foreign manufacturing facilities are located and where much FDI has been invested from outside of China. This region far outstrips other areas with foreign direct and private domestic investments. Domestically owned modern industries are favored by the government investment. Specialty crop farmers who cater to affluent urban markets do very well near these coastal towns as well. A core peripheral relationship now exists and is very strong between the interior and the coastal provinces. Foreign direct investment and special economic zones, or SEZs. The open door policies have recognized the benefits of foreign direct investment, and it has been found to be a win-win situation for both the foreign countries that are making the investments as well as for China itself and these industrial zones. The special economic zones were originally centered on the eastern seaboard cities. Hainan Island, for example, began to be developed extensively in 1988, with other regions on the seaboard also developing additional industrial capabilities. And in many days, as we said, these are like the modern day treaty ports of the 19th century. This map on page 469 shows very well the inequities in gross domestic product and production of various regions in China. We see the strongest gross domestic product per capita along the coast, with Shanghai and Beijing and Tianjin all having the strongest gross domestic product. These are the largest industrial regions with high-tech industries such as chemical production, information technology development, and things of that nature. The high-tech industry, as well as some of the older industrial zones, also along the east, have been very successful and profitable. Mining in Nay Mongol has risen or has raised the gross domestic product per capita of this region of China as well. The agricultural regions just interior to the east coast have profited from this system, but do not have the gross domestic product capacity or ability of the coastal cities, because these tend to be stronger in agricultural regions, although each does have the town and village enterprise systems helping to expand the economy and diversify the economy as well. The desert regions and the interior regions, the high mountain regions of Tibet, for example, gross domestic product is very low compared to the rest of China. China, urbanization and migration. Communist restriction on movement to urban centers was in place early on. It reduced unplanned growth, enabled China to avoid the squatter settlement and development of squatter sites and shanty towns that was seen in much of the rest of the developed world. The Hukou registration system restricted food and housing access of people to the region in which they resided and prevented much of the migration because people were unable to obtain housing and food through normal channels of government control. Early on, urban places were viewed with contempt and distrust. They were considered to be breeding grounds for more educated and commercially oriented capitalist urban classes, and that was considered kind of an evil in a way in Chinese culture. Anti-urban bias was exhibited in the Cultural Revolution of the early 1900s and into even the middle 1900s. There has since been a loosening of population movement restrictions, which has brought migration to the cities with something known as a floating population. Floating population are groups of rural migrants who move to urban locations where labor is needed in order to find a job. Urban housing is still, private ownership is a very small percentage of the population. There are some movement, though, away from government-run housing into local market principles and capitalistic availability of apartment and urban houses, especially in the extremely affluent industrial zones. China's urban growth, this chart is on page 474 of your text. We see up until about 1979, a relatively stable urban percentage population, even as the population grows significantly. But as we moved into the later 1900s, we see steady increase in the urban population as the industrial development zones begin to be successful and globalized sales increase significantly. As we move into the 21st century, we see that 50% of the population is classified as urban, a very rapid growth from the 1970s and 1980s with only a 15% urban population. China and Hong Kong. Returned to China from the United Kingdom in 1997, China promised to retain the political system for 50 years. However, China has more quickly removed political freedom, representation, and autonomy, appointing the leader of this region of China directly from Beijing and beginning to implement more typical Chinese education, language, and in industrial and economic methods. There are accusations that China is forcing educational changes in Hong Kong that many believe is directed as a political propaganda to create a more unified population with more equity in terms of education, equalizing Hong Kong with the rest of China. Hong Kong has significant pollution problems as the Pearl River Delta economic zone has increased production, and that pollution blows over Hong Kong. Hong Kong has significant air pollution problems, almost equal to the problems that exist in Beijing today as well. We've seen as recently as 2014 and early 2015 numerous protests within Hong Kong, relatively peaceful protests that have shut down major transportation thoroughfares throughout the Pearl River industrial region in Hong Kong. These have resided considerably as many people consider them to be adversely affecting productivity of the region. Beijing and Shanghai are the two largest cities within China. Both are megacities with over 10 million people in population. Beijing, as a city, dates back to the 13th century and traditionally typified conservative, orderly, and inward nature of Chinese culture, cutting off that globalization. And examples of this include the Forbidden City and Tiananmen Square, which are cultural centers for the entire country. It's also the political center of what the Chinese call the Middle Kingdom of China. Here in Beijing, we see light and heavy industry, and as I've said as well, development of a information technology industry and service industries. Shanghai represents the outward or commercial nature of the Chinese, the globalization. It began as a characteristic southern Chinese village on the coast with roots as a fishing village and food production, and became a leading industrial center with many international countries focusing on things like chemical production, textiles, and metal production. It's also an important food processing center for the rest of the country, and Pudong is the financial district of China, very important in terms of service industries, banking, and insurance. Well, that's it for our Lecture 2 in Chapter 10. We'll continue our Chapter 10 discussions in our next couple of lectures, and we will talk to you again then. Thanks for being here.